Thank you for listening to Pastor Sean's Bible Study Teaching podcast from Emmanuel Baptist Church in Sterling, Colorado. This lesson was recorded during our Wednesday night adult seminars. For more information on Emmanuel Baptist Church, please visit our website at www.ebc-online.org. Now here's Pastor Sean.
Of all the sermons I've done at this church, I'd probably say that when I did the RUTH series, it was probably my most enjoyable series. And it's hard to believe, I was talking with somebody, I think it was Marcine earlier, back in the fall of 2008 is when I preached on RUTH. And it was an interesting time in the life of our church because if you remember, that September we were supposed to move out of our building and go into limbo, either at Hagen or whatever, because New Beginnings was going to buy our building. And that ended up not happening. And so before that, we had 2 worship services, and we as elders decided, let's come back together as one church. So we all crammed together in that old sanctuary. And it seemed like when I preached RUTH, it was just a time where I just remember us being jam-packed in the sanctuary. And it was so you can go back on the website and listen to those sermons if you want a more detailed account. But I've tried to take a lot of the stuff from those sermons and condense it down into an hour-and-a-half teaching. Okay, so here we go. You guys ready for RUTH? Okay. RUTH is considered it should be 1. RUTH is considered, if there's any typos in this, blame me because I did all the typing on this. So RUTH is considered one of the greatest short stories in all of literature. Not just in the Bible, but in all of literature. There are 4 acts, okay? So think of this as like a story with 4 acts. 4 acts, 3 subplots in each act, okay? So there's 4 chapters, 4 acts. In each chapter, there's 3 basic subplots or 3 basic movements, okay? Now, remember, Hebrew storytelling, Hebrew narrative. This story is meant to be read out loud. If you remember from the first night that I talked and we talked about Hebrew narrative, all these Old Testament stories were meant to be carried out orally. And so that's why there's a lot of repetition. And the oral tradition allows for a play on words. So when you read this in the original Hebrew, there's some play on words, there's some twists, there's some turns. It's to keep the suspense going. If you read this in the NIV or the ESV or a modern translation, it only takes you about 20 minutes to read it out loud. So you can read the whole book of RUTH in 20 minutes out loud. And so that's where we're at tonight. Now, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at each act or each chapter and look at the subplots in each chapter and really dive into the book of RUTH. And so, let's look at Act 1, Subplot 1. But before we do that, what I want us to do is to look at the last chapter, last verse of Judges. Remember last week, what was the repeated theme in Judges? There was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. That's the very last verse of Judges, Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Boom, turn the page. RUTH is right there. In the days when the judges ruled. So when is RUTH taking place? It's taking place during the time of the judges, which we would say this. What's the main thing that happens in the time of the judges? Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Okay? So let's read subplot 1, verses 1 through 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Machlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other RUTH. They lived there about 10 years, and both Machlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, there's a lot of irony going on in this first plot, okay? Bethlehem means house of bread. But yet there is a famine in the house of bread. So where does this man decide to take his family? They're going to leave the promised land, and go to the greener grass in Moab. No self-respecting Hebrew would ever leave God's country to sojourn elsewhere, especially Moab. We'll talk a little bit about Moab here in a minute. What's this guy's name? Elimelech. That means my God is king. Do you hear the play on words there? It was during the time of the judges. There was no king in Israel. But my God is king takes his family out of Israel to Moab because there's a famine in the house of bread. Okay? Naomi's name. Her name means pleasant, which is very important because we find out she changes her name. Okay? Act 1, subplot 1 continued. Machlon, and you wonder why I say Machlon, because in the Hebrew that H almost sounds like a CH. Machlon means little sick one, and Kilion means annihilation. So names mean things in Ruth. And so when you have, okay, so my God is king, wife pleasant, go to Moab, and they have little sick one and annihilation. What do you think is going to happen to this family? Okay. Elimelech dies. My God is king dies. Now, we don't know why he dies. There is no answer to why he dies. We're just left hanging. Was it God's judgment because they left? Was it old age? Did he get sick? We're left with just not knowing. But he dies. And in a pagan land, Moab, little sick one and annihilation, the two boys, take pagan wives. Now what does Deuteronomy 7:3 say? You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. So remember, Deuteronomy says when you go into the promised land, don't intermarry. But that's what they do. Now Moab. Moab is known as a land of pagan sexuality. When Lot, back in Genesis, had an incestuous relationship with his daughter, they produced a son named Moab. In the book of Numbers, the Moabites were the tribe that always tempted the Israelites into sexual immorality. So Moab is a metaphor for a pagan land of sexual immorality. Okay? Now, what are the daughters' names? Orpah. Orpah means the back of the neck. And that's a foreshadowing. Back of the neck. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. Ruth, which is very, very encouraging, her name means a source of refreshing, comfort. You could almost say that Ruth's name means a spring of water. So names mean something in Ruth. What do you think from the very beginning we're going to find out about Ruth? If she's a source of refreshing, that's what she's going to live up to her name. Now, in verses 1 through 5, we have a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, don't we? A woman and father leave their home. They go to a pagan land. He dies. The two babies die. She's left all alone, and she's out of her own country. Now, her two sons died. Literally there, it says, so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husbands. Literally in the Hebrew, her two babies. Now, these are grown men, right, that are married. But in her mind, what? Not if they're your sons. They're still your babies. Okay? Now, I give a great quote here from Sinclair Ferguson. He says this: a sharp knife can be a destructive weapon in the hands of a murderer, but it can also be an instrument of healing in the hands of a surgeon. Everything depends on the hand that uses it. In this case, God is working like a skilled surgeon. The painful surgery is part of the healing process. So she goes through a huge tragedy, loses her husband, loses her two little babies, and so her heart has been pierced with the dagger of tragedy. So what I wrote up there is the question is not if you will face tragedy, but what? When. None of us is guaranteed a tragedy-free life. Now, some of us will have differing degrees of tragedies, differing degrees of suffering, but we're going to have times of trials, times of suffering, times of loss. And for Naomi, it's huge. She becomes a widow, and she loses her 2 baby boys. She's in a foreign land where she shouldn't have been in the first place. There's a famine. What's she going to do? So that's subplot 1 of Act 1. Sets the stage for the rest of the story. Now we get to subplot 2. This is verses 6 through 22. So let's read this together. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with me, or with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your peoples." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even I should have a husband this night and should bear sons. Would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, I will die, and and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. All right. The word return. How many times did you hear Naomi say return there? Return, girls, return, return. It's the Hebrew word shuv. Okay? Shuv. Sometimes a B in Hebrew has a V sound. Shuv means return, but it also means repent. So there's a play on words there, okay? Return to Moab, girls, but it also means repent. Now, God shows a kind providence to Naomi. Notice what it says in verse 6. God did what? Visited his people with food. So they leave because there's a famine, but now she just happens to hear that God had visited the people, and now there's starting to become food, there's crops, and so she's going to come back to Bethlehem because God had dealt kindly. Now, the word there for visit really means God equipped an army, literally. But in the context of Ruth, it means God assembled all the divine resources to intervene on behalf of his people. Okay? When she comes back, here's the question: will God, quote unquote, visit Naomi and restock what she lost in Moab? What did she lose? A husband, 2 sons, heirs, no children, no grandchildren. She's a woman that's lost everything. When she comes back to Bethlehem, will all that stuff be given back to her? Naomi's response to the girls, turn back. Basically saying, it's too late for me, but you girls have a better deal. Go back to Moab. You're still young. You're within childbearing age. Go back to your families. Go find a young husband. Go back to Moab. Don't follow me. But verse 13, what does she say? A key word in the book of Ruth. No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Who does she blame this on? It's not just bad luck. She says, God's behind this. God is doing this. And so from Naomi's perspective, she's kind of mad at God. She's blaming God. She's confused. And let's just stop right here. There's a lot of characters in the Bible that were mad at God. Job was mad at God. Habakkuk was mad at God. Jeremiah was mad at God. David was mad at God. Naomi's mad at God. So here's the question. Is it okay to be mad at God?
Be angry but sin not.
Okay, be angry and sin not. Biblically, I think it's okay to be mad at God for a season. If you stay there, it's unhealthy. But you can't be, we're not robots, we're humans. We have emotions, we have pains, we have hurts. It's okay to take our request to God and say, God, why are you doing this? Now, you don't want to stay there, but we see biblical examples of godly people that got mad at God. Now, the question is, how is God going to deal with Naomi? How is He going to redeem her? How is He going to work in her life? At this point, she's just bitter, okay? But what does Ruth do? Ruth clings. Davak. You remember that word, davak, we talked about a few weeks ago? It's used in Genesis chapter 2. A man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and they'll become one flesh. He shall davak. This is basically a way of saying Ruth embraced Naomi as her own mom and said, I'm going with you. I'm not going to go back to Moab. Orpah. Remember, what does Orpah mean? Back of the neck. What happens to Orpah? She goes back and all we see is the back of her neck. Never to see her again. So she lives up to her name. She shuved. She returned. But did she shuv? That's kind of a play on words. She returned, but did she repent? No, back of the neck. Now we're going to see Ruth returned, but instead of returning back to Moab, she returns to Israel. She actually repents. So there's a play on words there. Back of the neck returns. Ruth actually returns, but returns to or turns to the Lord. Okay? Now, verse 16 and 17, the powerful words of Ruth. Okay, look at verse 16 and 17. You've probably heard this before. A lot of times in marriage ceremonies, you hear this. Do not urge me to leave you, to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. This is none other than Ruth renouncing her ethnic roots as a Moabitess, adopting the national faith of Naomi to be numbered among the Israelites, and embraces Yahweh. This is her conversion. She's basically saying, I'm renouncing my pagan Moabitism, and I'm embracing the God of Israel. In other words, we could say in New Testament terms, she's repenting and believing in the Lord. It's her conversion. She's truly shuv. She's truly repenting or turning towards God. Now, what other great pagan woman have we seen in the Bible that has given such a great profession of faith? Rahab. Remember a few weeks ago? Rahab just happens, we'll find out, to be Ruth's other mother-in-law, not Naomi. But you have two pagan Gentile women confessing faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and saying, I'm going to forsake my idolatry and embrace the Lord. So we see an Old Testament picture here of conversion. This is Ruth's conversion. She shuvs, if you will, repents and turns and receives life in the Lord of Israel. And now here's a quote. I can't remember where I got this, but probably from some commentator. The Lord plus nothing in Bethlehem, or everything minus the Lord in Moab. The Lord plus nothing. She doesn't know what she's going back to when she goes to Bethlehem. She has nothing. No husband, no job, no life. All she has is a bitter mother-in-law. But that's enough for her because she's embraced the God of Israel. If she goes back to Moab, she can have everything that she wants. Husbands, life, family. But she would not have the Lord. So it's a huge step for Ruth to take. All right, let's look at Act 1, subplot 3. And I like the way that the ESV does this because they kind of break the subplots up in the paragraph headings. 19 through 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? She said to them, Do not call me Naomi, call me Marah, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Okay. Naomi changes her name. What does Naomi mean? Pleasant. What does she change it to? Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. Marah. Okay, marah. You say it in Hebrew, it just sounds like I'm marah, I'm bitter. Okay? Now, she doesn't chalk this up to fate. She doesn't chalk this up to some distant force. Again, she's blaming God. God, you're the one that did this to me. She sounds similar from Job. Does she ever get an answer from God? All she says here is, the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. She didn't say it was a string of bad luck. She doesn't say, somehow I sinned. She says, God did this and I'm mad at him. I'm bitter. Now, let's just look at this quote from Job, chapter 2. Job lost everything, didn't he? Except for his wife. He wasn't much help. But here's what Job's wife said. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this Job did not sin with his lips. You give and you take away. You give and you take away. But my heart will choose to say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Sometimes we have successes in life, blessings. Sometimes God allows us to go through trials. And so it's how we respond. And right now, Naomi is a bitter woman. She's bitter. She's angry. She comes back to Bethlehem. The ladies all greet her and like, oh, Naomi's back. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. Now, here's the question. Is God emptying her hands to fill them with something better? Does God ever do that? Does God empty your hands to fill them with something better? But what do we often do? We want to hold on to those things because we think that's what's going to give us meaning. And God may say, you know what, I'm going to pry your hands away from those things because I want to fill you with something better. Other question. God uses her suffering to bring about the conversion of a pagan sinner. Can God actually do that? She's a bitter woman, but in the midst of all of her bitterness, who becomes a Christian, if you will, Old Testament-wise? Ruth, in the midst of all of this. Okay. Act 1 ends. I'm sorry that the writing is so small on this. I had to fit everything in there. Act 1 ends with the coincidence or God's invisible hand of providence. When do they return to Bethlehem? Just so happens it's what? The beginning of the barley harvest. Now that may not mean much to us, but that's the setup. That's the setup. The most beautiful confession of statements of God's providence. Now what's God's providence? Basically, we don't talk a lot about God's providence, but it's this idea that a lot of times we expect God to work through miracles. We expect God to do these big and mighty things, and God can do those things, but oftentimes He kind of works behind the scenes to bring about His will, not in huge, exciting ways, but sometimes just in the everyday things of life. And so God may be orchestrating things in our life to bring about His will, to bring about our good, and we may not be seeing all of it, but the Heidelberg Catechism says this. What do you mean by the providence of God? The almighty and everywhere present power of God, whereby, as it were by His hand, He upholds and governs heaven, earth, and all creatures so that herbs and grass, rain and drought, fruitful and barren years, meat and drink, health and sickness, riches and poverty, yea, all things come not by chance, but by His fatherly hand. So providence would say the little blade of grass that grows in your yard is not by chance, but because God is ruling and governing over the whole universe. And so we may think, man, God's not in control, things are out of control, my life stinks, there's a lot of this stuff going on, but it could be God's behind the scenes allowing things to happen, moving things, orchestrating things to bring about a greater good. And He may take you through suffering in order to fill your hands with something better. That's what's going on to Naomi. Now, what advantage is it to us to know that God has created and by His providence does still uphold all things? That's question 28 of the Heidelberg Catechism. That we may be patient in adversity, thankful in prosperity, and then all things which may hereafter befall us, we place our firm trust in our faithful God and Father, that nothing shall separate us from His love, since all creatures are so in His hand that without His will they cannot so much as move. So what does providence help us do? It helps us trust, be patient, trust in the fatherly care of God, that we may not know what God's doing, but He knows what He's doing, and we trust in His compassion and His love for us, that He will never leave us or forsake us. Okay, so now we get to Act 2, or Chapter 2, Subplot 1. 2 verses here. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said, to her, "Go, my daughter." Okay, here's a little tidbit of information. In the Hebrew Bible, now in the Hebrew Bible, the order of the books is different than what we have in our English Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, guess what comes right before Ruth? Proverbs. What's the last chapter of Proverbs? Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31 talks about the noble woman. So if you were to read the Hebrew Bible, it segues right from the noble woman into the story of Ruth. So I think sometimes the Hebrew Bible kind of a little different, but it's an interesting way to do that. Okay. Now we have Boaz. Introducing Boaz. Okay, he's a worthy man. Pay attention to that because remember the context. What is going on here? This is the time of the judges where everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Have we seen a worthy man in Judges last week? I mean, did we really see anything worthy? Some of you were like, I got an email from somebody that said they were so sick they almost wanted to walk out of class. But they understood that it was, her email was, it was helpful because it showed me the power of the gospel. But we, Judges last week was pretty. Do we find anything worthy in Judges? But here we have, in the time of the Judges, a worthy man. And what do we know about this worthy man? He just so happens to be what? A relative of Elimelech. Coincidence? Probably not. Now, Ruth and Naomi are sitting at the breakfast table. Ruth is a Moabitess, remember. How will she be accepted in this new land? I've made the decision to forsake all to come to Bethlehem. I've forsaken my family, my God, my paganism, my culture, everything that was my identity as a Moabitess, I've given up to come to Bethlehem, and now I have no idea what my future holds. Will I be accepted? Will I get a job? Was it really worth it all to forsake all of Moab to embrace the Lord of Israel? Now, what does she do? She takes the initiative. That's a good thing with Ruth. She doesn't sit around and wait for a government handout. She gets busy. Okay, now I'm not trying to say that, you understand what I'm saying. She doesn't sit around and say, what should I do? If God is sovereign, I should just sit back and He'll plop a job in my lap. What does she do? I'm going to get up and I'm going to go find a job. Now, God does have a welfare system, okay, in that culture. If you go back to Leviticus 19, you have what's called the gleaning laws, okay? So let me draw on the board here how fields in that time would look. Now, when we think about fields, what do we normally think about? We think about fences, right? You know somebody's field because they have a barbed wire fence around it. They didn't have fences back then. They would have large tracts of land that different landowners would own. But let's say this is your tract of land, okay? What they would do is they would cut off the corners of the land and leave that for the poor people to come, and they could get this little area right here off the field. The whole field was left for the landowner, and also, once you'd come through and start harvesting, you could come behind the gleaners and get what was ever left over. Okay? So you could take the initiative if you wanted to. You could go out, you could go on these four corners, get wheat, or you could follow the gleaners, follow the harvesters, and whatever stuff was left over, you could take the initiative and bushel all that up yourself. So that was God's welfare system. Okay? The poor people, the outcast, if they wanted to, they didn't have to sit at home and wait for a handout. They could go behind and do some work, and God provided a way for them to be taken care of. But there had to be some initiative in that. Okay? Now, let's go to subplot 2. Verses 3 through 17. So, she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Now remember, guys, you don't know. If she were just to walk out to this field, she would have no idea which field's Boaz. There was not a big sign saying Boaz's field. There wasn't barbed wire around there with J bar Boaz, letting you know it was his. You would just go see all these tracts of land out there and you would just start gleaning. But it just so happens, quote unquote, coincidence, that she lands on Boaz's field, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law, since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward will be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. And at mealtime Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Okay. Just so happened, or literally in the Hebrew, as luck would have it. Now, is it luck? No. Okay. Proverbs 16:9. The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. That's a good thing to know. God is sovereignly orchestrating this chance encounter with Boaz, this string of luck. The writer of Ruth is kind of playing with us. He's using this luck terminology, even though it's not luck, as a way for us to kind of, oh, wow, what a coincidence. Okay, now Boaz treats his employees with dignity. He's a godly man. So Boaz here emerges as a godly employer. He's a respectful man. He treats people with dignity. He emerges as a man that's totally different than what we'd expect in Judges. So he shows up as a worthy man. Now let's look at Ruth's humility. She asks permission to glean. She doesn't go and demand her rights and say, you've got to let me glean here. She says, please let me glean. She knew her rightful place. She's like, let me glean behind the reapers. I'm a foreigner. I don't even belong in this land. If you would, sir, would you please just allow me to glean behind the reapers? And she had a tremendous work ethic. It says she worked early morning to late afternoon with just a few short rests. So she's a godly, humble woman who takes initiative, hard worker, a model woman. Doesn't that sound a lot like, if you go back and read Proverbs 31, it sounds like the noble woman. And that's what Ruth is emerging as. And Boaz is graciousness. If Ruth is humble, Boaz is gracious. Remember, this is the time of the judges. We need to always keep that in our heads. This is the time of the judges, where everyone did what was right in his own eyes. He provides for Ruth. He gives her access to the water. Now, that may not seem like a big deal. Like, you can drink from the water cooler. But normally what would happen is they would have water coolers available for the reapers. But if you were a slave or a servant, you had to go all the way across the field to get your own water. And he says, no, you can drink out of the water cooler that everybody else drinks of. So Boaz is being very generous. And he says he's a provider. And so I have a question there for men. Men, are we providers for our wives? Do we provide? He protects her. He institutes an anti-harassment policy. What does he say? My men, none of those men out there can touch you, Ruth. If they touch you, they're going to be in big trouble. So remember, this is the time of the judges, where what stays out in the field, what happens on the field stays on the field. Some guy could have taken her off in a corner and done something, harassed her, maybe almost to the point of maybe doing something even extreme. So he's a protector. Men, are we a protector of our wives? Now, why is Boaz's behavior so amazing? Remember, this is the time of the judges. Boaz doesn't have to do this. Everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes. He was not accountable to anybody himself. He's the boss. He was the top dog out in the fields. He didn't have to do any of this, but he does it because he is gracious. He's gracious. He's also hospitable. He invites her to eat at his table. Now, this is a big deal. He says, come eat at my table. Now, he broke some barriers. What's the first barrier he breaks? A social barrier. She's a Moabitess. She's a woman. But he's going to invite her to eat at his table. He breaks a racial barrier. And then Boaz actually serves Ruth. Great generosity. What does he do? In verses 15 and 16, he tells her that she can glean, but he also says, go out among the sheaves. Now that was special because the gleaning policy said, okay, you can go behind the gleaners or the reapers. But they had these sheaves areas over here where there would be more grain. He says, not only can you go behind the reapers, but you can go over here among the sheaves and get more barley. So he gives her permission to actually get more. And what ends up happening is she gets 30 pounds of barley at the end of one day. 30 pounds of barley is basically a half a month's wages in just one day. That's a lot of moolah. Just in one day. Okay, now how do you think Naomi's going to respond when Ruth comes home from her first day of work? Let's look at subplot 3, okay? Subplot 3. Oh, no, we're not done yet. We've got to go back and look at this very important part. Verses 2, 10 through 12. Verses 2, 10 through 12. Ruth is amazed. She's like, why have I found favor in your eyes? Why have I found favor in your eyes? Why me of all the women that you could have done this to? Was it her charm? Was it her attractiveness? Was it her personality? What attracted Boaz to her? Did you catch what was attractive to her? Her testimony. What does he say? But Boaz, look verse 11, but Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. What attracted Boaz to Ruth? Shuv. You turned from your idolatry and you came to embrace the God of Israel and showed kindness to Naomi. I'm enamored by your testimony, your godly testimony. Now, her salvation here is described as being like a little eaglet under the wings of a great and powerful protective eagle. Remember this imagery here. Verse 12, the Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward will be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Okay, wings. God here is referred to as stretching out his wings. And so her salvation is pictured here as God is this big, huge eagle that protects her, that brings her in salvation. She's this helpless little eaglet that comes under the protection of an eagle. And so this romance here is blossoming based upon character. Character, her testimony, her godliness. That's what it's based upon. Not what most romances blossom under in today's culture. What do most romances blossom under today? Looks, charm, personality, money. Very rarely are relationships based upon godliness, character, personal testimony, salvation. Okay, let's go back to Marah. 17 through 23. All right, so she gleaned in the field until evening, then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. So she even had food left over. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? Where have you worked? You got a half month's wages in one day. Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is dun, 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 dun. You notice how like the build-up? His name is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Back to Marah. Okay, she's been bitter, right? But she gets some exciting news, okay? Listen to what Martin Lloyd-Jones says. He has great words on bitterness. I grant that there may be genuine grievances, but what makes us bitter is that we ponder them and meditate upon them and stay with them. In other words, we nurse our grievances. We dwell on them. We pay attention to them. And if we are tending to forget them, we deliberately bring them back and allow them to work up at us in a state of bitterness. Now, like I said earlier, is it okay to be mad at God? Yes. But bitterness is a sin. You can go trace a lot of scriptures that talk about a root of bitterness. Bitterness is poisonous. Bitterness eats at you. Anger and wrath gone unchecked will just turn into bitterness. And Naomi could have been a very, very bitter woman who nursed a grievance. Think about that imagery. You're nursing a grievance. Instead of just getting over it, dealing with it, allowing God to take you through it, you tend to nurse the grievance. Okay, let's keep going here. God's kindness, there's light at the end of the tunnel. God's kindness is being recognized. In chapter 2, verse 20, she says, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. What did she say before? God's done this to me. Now she's saying, God's being kindness to me. Now, you guys should recognize that word kindness. It's the word hesed, loving kindness, mercy. God, there's light at the end of the tunnel. There is a goel. Boaz is a goel. That means a kinsman redeemer. Someone who is a kin or a relative that would come in and redeem. Basically, in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, there was what was called the Levirate marriage laws. And it was basically like if you were a widow, the next in like your husband's brother may have to come in and provide for the family and take care of all the issues. There were these rules that widows would not be forsaken, that the relatives would come and redeem them. But here's the issue. Legally, if you go back and look at this, Boaz doesn't have any obligation to marry Ruth. We'll find out this later. She's really free to marry whoever she wants. He has no legal obligation to do that. But he comes to the rescue / salvation of Ruth and Naomi, not because the law is demanding that he do so, but because of voluntary grace, like Jesus. Does Jesus have to save us? No. Why does he save us? Because of grace. He voluntarily went to the cross, laid down his life for us because he loved us. Now, what's Naomi's hidden agenda? Okay, Ruth, work close to Boaz until the harvest is over. This would be a good 2 months to get this romance brewing. Go out there and hang out with this dude for 2 months. The closer you are to him, maybe, you can get his attention. But Act 2 ends with a sudden thud. You'd think that after 2 months, Boaz would recognize. You're thinking in your mind, okay, the romance is blossoming. The 2 months is over. The couple's going to fall in love. But what does it say? Ruth and Naomi are still alone. Her regular contact with Boaz comes to an end. And the two widows are just at home waiting for things to happen. Or does this Jewish grandmother have something up her sleeve? Let's look at Act 3, subplot 1. This is where it gets a little interesting. All right. Then Naomi and her mother-in-law said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloth, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. Now, what in the world is going on here? Naomi is slowly transforming, but what in the world is she thinking? She wants Ruth to be alluring. Dress, Put on some makeup, put on some perfume, go take a bath, dress real nice, go down to the threshing floor. Now, how does Naomi know that Boaz will be at the threshing floor at midnight? She makes it her business to know. We don't know how she knows it, but she knows. She knows. Now, why is Ruth to make sure she sees where Boaz sleeps? If she accidentally wakes up the wrong man, it could be really bad. Okay, it could be disastrous. This is risky. This is a risky midnight scene that places Ruth solely at the mercy of Boaz. Now remember, guys, what's the context? This is the time of the judges, where everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Okay? In that culture, winnowing was a joyous and should be festive climax to the harvest season. So Boaz is out there, he's winnowing, he's harvesting, he's enjoying a good bottle of brew afterwards, and not that he's getting drunk or anything, he just sits down after a good day's work, and it's the climax of harvest season. It's dark midnight. That's why she asks who he is. Now let's look at the subplot 6 through 15. Here we go. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" I don't know if he said it like that. And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but arose before anyone could recognize who she was. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. Okay. It's midnight. That's why she asks who she was. He didn't know who she was. Now, here's something very important. What happened on threshing floors in ancient Israel, especially during the time of the judges, was almost like something like a Las Vegas ad. What happens on threshing floors stays on threshing floors. This is where prostitutes would turn their tricks. Boaz knows what this could mean from his mother, Rahab. So this could be disastrous if it went wrong. Okay? Now, in verse 9, what does she say? Spread your wings. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now remember back in verse 12? It said, the Lord spread his wings over her. It's a play on words there. What is Ruth doing when she says to Boaz, spread out your wings? We may not quite understand this because we're removed from the culture, but basically it's none other than her proposing to Boaz. She's basically saying, Boaz, will you marry me? Spreading out your wings was symbolic of saying, Boaz, I want your protection, I want your love, I want your covering. Take me as your own. Would you please marry me? Now, this is not normative for today, okay? So if you're a young college girl that wants to get married, don't go down to a threshing floor at night and uncover somebody's, feet and ask the guy to marry you, okay? Probably not normative for today. Now, the wording of spread out your wings from 2 verse 12 will probably trigger Boaz's memory to act richly toward her. Because he said, back in chapter 2 verse 12, he says that may the Lord reward you. May the Lord repay you. Here's where it's happening. He didn't know what he spoke of back then. You came under the Lord's wings. May the Lord repay you for your kindness. Now she's saying, okay, now's the time. Will you please marry me? Will you spread out your wings? He's going to show kindness. Now, Boaz the noble. In verse 10, what does he say? May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. Now, two things Boaz could have done, because this is the time of the judges where everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and he's at the threshing floor. Number one, he could have taken advantage of Ruth, and no one would ever know. Number two, he could have gotten her face and rebuked her and humiliated her for acting like a prostitute. Does he do either one of those? No, he's gentle with this new believer. He doesn't crush her. He basically acts gently towards her and says, may you be blessed. Play on words here, okay? Boaz says, I know that you are a worthy woman. What did we find out back in chapter 2, verse 1 about Boaz? He was a what? A worthy man. He's worthy. She's worthy. It's a match made in heaven, right? The two soulmates are going to come together as one. And he says, you're free to marry whoever you want. Notice what he says. You've not gone after the young men, rich or poor. You have not gone off to marry these men. You could have married anybody, but you're coming to me. He knows that. If he's going to act kindly toward her, it will be because of his mercy and his gracious character. Now, we stand up and cheer because here comes the moment we've been waiting for, right? This budding romance is happening. It's the moment where, they're going to kiss and the curtain's going to fall down. They're going to live happily ever after, right? It's the moment we're waiting for. But then he drops the bombshell, or what I would say, the monkey wrench. Okay? What does he say? Verse 12. I know it's true that I'm a redeemer, yet there's a guy that's closer in line than me. There's one that has first priority. Now, this would have made Ruth's heart stop. Why in the world didn't Naomi tell me? I have made a fool of myself. Now, you may ask, well, why doesn't Boaz bend the rules here? Why doesn't he just say, well, yeah, there's a guy that's closer, but I'll just go ahead and do it? He's a righteous man. He's a man of integrity. He's not going to manipulate the system to his favor. He's going to abide by the rules. Now remember, this is the time of the judges, which makes this even more remarkable. He could have very easily bent the rules, manipulated the situation, got his way, did whatever he needed to do to politically maneuver, but he doesn't do that. He says, you know what? I'm going to be a man of integrity. The rules say there's a guy in front of me. I'm going to allow it to play out, and we're going to see what happens. Okay, now, we've got to talk about sexual purity here, because at this point you may be asking, okay, what's the big deal with her laying down at his feet overnight? Wouldn't he just send her home? What would happen if he would have sent her home at that point? Where are they? Threshing floor. Would it have been safe for her? If she would have gone out of his care, who knows what could have happened to her? So she lays at his feet. Now, verse 13 says, remain tonight. Remain. In the original Hebrew, this does not carry any sexual connotations. The storyteller is going out of his way to show us that nothing happened. He's making great pains in the original language to say nothing happened. And Boaz promises to redeem Ruth. And verse 14, he protects her reputation. He says, okay, go early in the morning, before anybody's up, go back to Bethlehem. She needs to make a daring daylight escape to Bethlehem so no one will see her. If she leaves in the middle of the night, she could get raped or taken advantage of. Now, what is she? Remember, she's a Moabitess. What did we say earlier about Moabitesses? Well, she's just that, sexually promiscuous pagan woman that came from Moab. We know what Moabite women are like. But she's been converted. And Boaz understands that her very spiritual reputation is on the line, and he's going to protect that at all costs. He's a godly man. Now, Boaz leaves her with a very generous gift. What does he give her? 80 pounds of grain. Okay, now let's get to subplot 3. Okay, subplot 3. Verse 16. How did she get back home? With the The question is, she's a strong woman. She had to be a strong woman to carry 80 pounds of grain. Or she could have had a helper. She could have just been a strong woman. All right, look, verse 16. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.' She replied, 'Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today.'" Okay, the frantic Jewish mother-in-law is at home pacing the floor, biting her nails. I've sent Naomi out to the threshing floor. What's going to happen? Did everything go all right? So she's finally waiting for her. And so Ruth barges through the door. She's got this 80-pound bag on her back. And what does Naomi do? Holy cow. This is a pledge. This is a signal. It's Boaz's way of saying that he's going to not leave her empty-handed. Now, when she left Moab, what was she? She was empty-handed. The question is, when she comes back to Bethlehem, house of bread, will she be filled? Will she be restocked? Not with food, but with something even greater. He says he will do everything in his power to secure their future. This is a symbolic way of saying, Naomi, this is my down payment that I'm going to make right on this. Okay, but here's the issue. Act 3 ends with a tension, a cliffhanger. What does Naomi do? She says, okay, we got to sit, we got to wait. The Hebrew really means we got to just kind of roll the dice. Again, he's playing with us. Well, let's just trust luck. Again, the storyteller knows it's not luck, it's God's providence. We just have to wait. But what does she say? The man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Boaz as a type of Christ. Jesus is the greater Boaz. Jesus is our Redeemer. We as the church are his bride, and he bought us at a tremendous price. He didn't just, pay 80 pounds of barley, but he gave his own life as a down payment that we would be having a home in heaven. Boaz would finish the task. He would not rest until he settled the matter. Does that sound familiar? What did Jesus say when he was on the cross? It is finished. And what did Jesus do? He spread his wings of love over us in permanent salvation and will never leave us nor forsake us. All right. Let's go to subplot 4 and see how this story ends. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. But Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." And then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Machlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Machlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of this native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Epaphra and renown in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you to be this young woman." Okay. It should be well, that really should be 4, 1 through 12. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong thing here. So he goes to the city gate. The city gate was a public gathering place where business transactions were and legal matters were conducted. And so what we have here is we have the Redeemer. Behold, as luck would have it, the guy just so happens to show up. Is it luck or is it God's invisible hand of grace? He's not even given a name, but in the Hebrew his name is Mr. So-and-so. That's what his name is. We don't even have a name for him. He's Mr. So-and-so. So Mr. So-and-so just happens to show up at just the right time. Think about what's going on. At just the right time, they came back when it was barley harvest. At just the right time, Ruth just happened to be on Boaz's land. It just so happened at just the right time, as luck would have it, this Mr. So-and-so shows up. And we're thinking all along, is this just a coincidence or is this really God behind the scenes? Okay. So Mr. So-and-so looks at this as a lucrative deal. Okay, this is a good deal. For very little money, I could carry out a respected family duty. It would enhance my reputation in the eyes of the community. I would get a great financial investment. Hey, there's no heirs in the deal because Naomi's a widow. Her boys are dead. Nobody would come after the fact, claim the property. Naomi's old. She's a widow. This is a done deal. This is a slam dunk. Now, we're biting our nails in frustration at this time because we're thinking at this point, remember oral tradition, if you're hearing the story for the first time, it looks like there's this love story between Ruth and Boaz brewing, and all of a sudden Mr. So-and-so comes up and he's going to save the day. He's going to win the day, and he's going to make things right. And we're like, why in the world does Mr. So-and-so get his way as opposed to Boaz? But then we find out that Boaz just kind of drops a little bit of information in there. Surprise, surprise. Boaz gives one other piece of information. Oh yeah, by the way, there's Ruth. And the guy says, oh, wait a minute, I can't do that. Steps back, thinks twice, and gives permission to Boaz. Now, when we think about this, yes, Boaz, this is a business transaction, yes. But he's not a cold and calculating man who's conducting a business transaction here. What's he doing? He's a godly man who wants to go to great lengths to save her. Sounds like Jesus, right? Verse 10 is the climax up to this point. What does he say in verse 10? Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Machlon, I have bought to be my wife. And we stand up and cheer because he's finally saying, she's going to be my wife. He declares that he has bought her, he's redeemed Ruth to be his wife. Now it's interesting because the people and the elders call upon the Lord to bless Ruth. Now remember, she's a Moabitess, she's a Gentile, and they're giving her the blessing of who? Rachel and Leah. Now do you remember back from Genesis, who are Rachel and Leah? They're the moms of the 12 tribes of Israel. They're the founding mothers of the Israelites. And basically what they're saying is, Ruth, it's a profound way of saying that this Moabite Gentile, who's now a redeemed child of Yahweh, would have a foundational role in the nation of Israel, just like the founding mothers. Ruth, we're putting you on the same plane as the founding mothers of Israel. May you be blessed. They pronounce a blessing on Boaz that he would have a dynasty. Does this crowd have any idea what they're doing? Ruth, you're going to have a role in the nation of Israel. Boaz, you're going to have a perpetual dynasty. Yeah, right. But we find out. Yes, Brent.
Well, also, as well, putting it through potentially a form of incest. Meaning that they're saying, maybe do it, just like this happened. You know, through Tamar and Judah, her father-in-law. And it's like they don't care what kind of poor living or whatever else is done. It's just thrown out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's some question why the whole issue of Perez and Judah and Tamar are in that story. But I think it goes back to a foreshadowing of the Lion of the tribe of Judah there. Now let's see Jesus. In Ruth, who is the strongest and most noble man to emerge out of Bethlehem? Boaz. Jesus is the ultimate God-man to emerge out of Bethlehem. The Lion of the tribe of Judah. What did Boaz say to Ruth? I will do all that you say and more. What does Jesus do for us? The glories of the cross and more. What is Romans 8:32? He who did not spare his own son but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us what? All things. Because of the cross, God gives us all of these spiritual blessings. We get Jesus and then some, more Jesus. Act 4, subplot 2, verses 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception and bore a son. Just a side note here, they did it right? They got married, then they had sex, then they birthed a child, okay? Just for clarification there, just in case our culture doesn't quite understand the order of how things happen. So Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, then he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who's not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay, who's the hero in this story, ultimately? God. God is the hero in the story. I mean, we look at Ruth, we look at Boaz, we look at Naomi, 3 larger than life characters, but ultimately at the end of the day, who's the one that's done all this? God. Now, the consummation. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz, they have a son, Obed. Now, Obed means servant of Yahweh, or servant of the Lord is what Obed means. Naomi, who left house of bread and went to Moab, came back empty and bitter, has now been filled to the brim with an heir. She's been restocked, if you will. Not with grain, but with what? A child. An heir. And in verse 16, we see this final tender moment. What's Naomi doing? It's the final time she appears in the story, and what's going on? She's got the bouncing baby boy on her knee, and she's his nanny. She's his nurse. So Naomi gets to actually raise this son. So Ruth gives Naomi this wonderful privilege of being instrumental in raising this boy. Because Ruth knew all along that was what Naomi struggled with the most, is I'm not going to have a son. I've lost my babies. And Ruth could have said, you know what? Naomi, it's been fun hanging out with you. You've been a bitter woman. You maybe go down to the threshing floor at midnight. It could have gone wrong. Boaz and I are married. We did not build an addition for the mother-in-law. Go have a nice life. But Ruth doesn't do that. What does she do? She shows hesed to her mother-in-law because she knew that that's what her mother-in-law needed, to love that baby, and she gives her an instrumental role in that. Okay? Now, a king, the ultimate climax of the story. Okay, let's think about the progression here. Not only does God sovereignly provide a redeemer specifically for Naomi, but in the act of doing that, God sovereignly provides a king for Israel in David. Remember Elimelech's name? My God is king. How does the story begin? With a man whose name carries kingship dying a sudden death, and the story ends with the announcement of Israel's greatest king, David. But not only that, who is David's greater son? Who is the King of Kings? King Jesus. So the story begins with Naomi getting redeemed, the nation getting redeemed, but then the entire world getting redeemed through Jesus. Let's look at this last subplot. It's not really a subplot, it's more of a genealogy, but it's interesting how this is tacked on to the end. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Abinadab. Abinadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Now we have to ask the question, why do we end the story with the genealogy? Why do we? And the very last word in Ruth is David. You end the story with the word David echoing on your ears and on your lips. Now here's the theological issue. Theologically, the genealogy demonstrates that in the darkest days of Israel, the days of the judges, the chosen line of God's people is preserved not through heroic deliverers like the judges, military rulers, or mighty kings, but by the invisible hand of God who rewards His people with grace, with the fullness beyond imagination. Remember, this is the time of the judges. When things are going bad, it's the darkest days, but how does God preserve His line? Through ordinary people that are godly. What do we see markedly absent in the book of Ruth? Are there any burning bushes? Any parting of the Red Seas? Any major miracles? Now those happen in the Bible, but Ruth is a story of just ordinary people, the mysterious providence of God working in the everyday lives of His children. Probably more like it happens in our day. Just being faithful to God, walking close to God, and God working behind the scenes to bring about His will, shaping His people. Now, another genealogy, Matthew chapter 1. We've talked about this when we talked about Rahab. Ruth is one of the 5 women to be part of Jesus' genealogy. Her mother-in-law Rahab is in it also. In other words, no Ruth, no Jesus. Plain and simple. The story of Ruth centers on Bethlehem with one family who's without food. Okay? One little town of Bethlehem, one little family. It's just a really tiny little story here, right? We think, oh, it's insignificant. One family, Bethlehem, no food, who cares? But God's sovereign grace extends to the entire nation through David and eventually to the entire world through Jesus. So what started with one little story with one little woman in one little town eventually brought about Jesus coming from Bethlehem to be the Savior of the entire world. Here's some closing thoughts. I wonder if Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi knew at the time that their story was part of a greater story. I doubt it. They probably had no idea that they were going to be part of the lineage of David eventually to Jesus. Historically, Ruth is read and celebrated during the Jewish festival of Pentecost. What is Pentecost? It's the day of harvest. Okay? It's a celebration of Jewish harvest. Ruth is a time of harvest. But what's more important about Pentecost? It's the day when God poured out His Spirit on all nations, signifying what? The inclusion of the Gentiles. So literally, Ruth is the first fruit of Gentile inclusion, which we experience today because of the gospel in Pentecost. The first fruits at Pentecost, we think, okay, Pentecost was when the Gentile, and Acts was when the Gentiles were, enfolded into God's kingdom. In a sense, yes, but we've already seen 2 Gentiles, Rahab and Ruth, that are enfolded into God's kingdom. They're the first fruits of what Pentecost would bring, the ultimate harvest, and we're still a part of that story. Final thoughts some more. What's your name? Is your name Marah? Is your name Ruth? Or is your name Elimelech? My God is King. And I think as believers in Jesus Christ, I think our anthem would be, Jesus is my King. That's what we want our name to be on our lips, that Jesus is my King. And you got out early tonight, unless there's any other questions or comments or snide remarks, because Ruth's a short book. Any questions or comments or closing thoughts on the book of Ruth?
Is there any timeline, like how long before the husbands died?
Yeah. Didn't it say they were there 10 years? Let's see here. Yeah, they lived there, between how long they lived there before they lived there 10 years. And then the guys died. You look at chapter 1, verse 4. They lived there about 10 years. So, yeah. And we really don't know at what judge was judging during this time. All we know is it's during the time of the judges. So I'm not sure exactly which judge. But we saw enough of them last week to know it wasn't a pretty time, right? It wasn't a pretty day in the life. Yes, Randy?
With a story like this, how come the Jews can't accept Jesus?
That's a great question. That's the ultimate question that we have to ask a lot of times, is when you look at these stories in the Old Testament that have types and shadows of Jesus that clearly portray the gospel, how can people that are Jewish that just read this as an Old Testament story, how can they not see Christ as Messiah? And the only answer I have on that is that we see it in the New Testament where they rejected Jesus, the Jews did. We're going to see it this Sunday in Acts where the Jews rejected Jesus. And the Bible says there's a partial blinding and hardening on the Jews until the end times where there will be a I guess the veil will be lifted and they'll be able to see it. Doesn't mean that there won't be any Jews that are saved. It just means that for some strange reason, they can't see that Christ is the fulfillment of all these things as the Messiah. It's hard to conceive, isn't it? Because we look at this and say, man, you can see Jesus all through this thing.
And I think you do have some who have seen it.
Yes.
Because there are obviously
Yes.
some Jews
Yes.
who have placed faith in Christ. And,
Yeah, a lot.
you know, so
Yeah, there's a lot of Messianic Jews. They're called Messianic Jews or completed Jews. But there's also a lot that don't. Yes, Jeff.
This is just a little off topic. I was just wondering if you knew, Ruth ends with David. Do you know where the Star of David comes from or how that originated and becoming the symbol of?
I'd probably have to do some more research on that. I don't really know.
I was
Yeah.
just wondering if you knew.
Yeah, I don't know exactly.
Prophecy was by Balaam and during the Exodus time frame that there'll be a star over. I can't remember exactly.
Well,
what prophecy.
a lot of there's prophecies about star, but it's actually how they got the.
Yeah.
Did you have another comment, Robert? Or? Okay. Yes, Brent.
Is there anything ever scripturally that says that this was his only wife, or
Whose only wife?
in terms of Ruth being Boaz's only wife?
Well, I guess I mean, you have to read the story and realize that. I mean, nobody. He doesn't say. I mean,
Well, the only reason I say is that there's so many other scriptural characters that had multiple wives.
right,
in
and
so
that's.
many places.
Well, and let's answer that question. The question is, did Boaz have another wife? Why was it just, one man, one woman? I think it goes back to the time of, this is the time of the judges, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. He's a worthy man. And so here you have a guy living in that culture that's actually obeying what Genesis 2 says about marriage, which makes it even more amazing.
Right, and that's what I was saying is there anything besides the book of Ruth that actually says something
Not that I know of.
you could use as confirmation that, because to me that would also point to Christ, is that Christ is the only way and the bridegroom and the bride
Right,
one, not
right,
one and one.
right.
So I just
Yeah, I don't know of any other source. Cindy, did you have a question, or were you just raising your hand on behalf of your husband? Anybody else? Next week, we're going to start looking into Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel are actually treated as one book in the Old Testament Bible. And so we start getting into the role of Samuel being called, Hannah, Samuel, the calling of Saul, Saul, David, Samuel, the three big characters. And then we start moving into kingship and all that stuff, moving from a theocracy to a monarchy and things like that. So that's where we're going to go next week. All right, let me pray for us, and then we'll be out of here. Father, thank you for this great story of Ruth, Lord. I love to read about just these noble characters that lived godly lives, were gracious, were hospitable, were pure. And Lord, most of all, we see you, Jesus, as being our Redeemer, that you went to great lengths to purchase us because you loved us. You completed the task. You cried out, "It is finished." You spread your wings of love over us. You'll never leave us or forsake us. And Lord, it's fun to see the story of how this all worked through a Gentile Moabite to bring about King David that eventually brought you, Jesus. And so it shows us that you love all types of people, Lord, that you are not just loving the Jews, but Jews and Gentiles. And the Bible says you will draw all types of people to yourself. And so we're thankful for that. Thank you, Jesus, for your grace. Bring us back safely this next week. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.